No. Oh, no. Not again. This can't be real. I... I don't understand. My home. A business? After everything, you're leaving me with this?
The 17th collection letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. I almost tossed it into the recycling with the others until one sentence stopped me cold. This address has served as the registered business location for 4 years. My hands began to shake. I had never owned a business in my life. The only person who had ever asked to use my address was my son Ethan, and he had promised it would be just for a little while. As I opened that envelope, I realized every collection letter had been trying to tell me the same thing. My son wasn't simply drowning in debt, he had been hiding his entire life behind my front door. If this story touches your heart, I'd truly appreciate it if you took a moment to like this video. And if you've ever had someone you loved keep a painful secret from you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and knowing we're sharing this moment together. People often assume that retirement is quiet. They imagine mornings with coffee on the porch afternoons, tending flowers evenings with a good mystery novel and an early bedtime. For the most part, that's exactly what my life had become. After 38 years as an elementary school librarian in Columbus, Ohio, I had earned every peaceful day. My little white brick house sat at the end of a tree-lined street where everyone knew everyone else. Children still rode bicycles past my front yard after school. My closest friend and neighbor, Margaret Ellis, lived across the street. Every Wednesday, we shared lunch at the same family diner we'd been visiting for nearly 20 years. I wasn't lonely. Not really. My son Ethan visited often enough to make me feel included in his life. Sometimes he'd stop by on Sunday afternoons carrying groceries before I even asked. Other weekends, he'd fix a loose cabinet hinge or replace a burned-out porch light. He always kissed my forehead before leaving. "Love you, Mom." Those 3 words were enough to make every sacrifice I'd made raising him feel worthwhile. After my husband Richard passed away 9 years earlier, Ethan became even more attentive. He insisted on mowing my lawn, checking my furnace every winter, and driving me to doctor's appointments whenever he could. People told me I was lucky. I believed them. When Ethan announced that he was leaving his management job to start his own home renovation company, I couldn't have been prouder. "I'm finally betting on myself," he said over dinner one evening. His eyes sparkled with excitement. "I've spent years making other people rich. It's time to build something of my own." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Your father always dreamed of owning his own business," I told him. "He'd be so proud of you." Ethan smiled. "I hope so." For the first year, everything seemed wonderful. His company appeared to grow quickly. Every few weeks he told me about another kitchen remodel, another bathroom renovation, another satisfied customer. His pickup truck was always covered in dust from construction sites. He sounded exhausted whenever we talked. I thought that meant success. Then one Saturday afternoon he arrived carrying a cardboard box filled with folders. He looked embarrassed. "Mom, can I ask you a favor?" "Of course." "My office lease is ending sooner than expected." "What happened?" "The landlord sold the building." He shrugged as though it were nothing. "My accountant says changing the business address twice in 1 year could slow down some paperwork." I didn't understand much about business regulations. "What do you need?" "Could I use your address for a little while?" He said it so casually. "Just until I find a permanent office." "How long?" "Maybe 2 months." He smiled exactly the way he used to when he was 10 years old and wanted permission to stay up past bedtime. "It'll save me a lot of headaches." I laughed. "If all you need is my mailbox, you've got it." He stood and hugged me. "You're the best mom." I never imagined those 5 words, "you've got it," would become the biggest mistake I'd ever make. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A few envelopes arrived each week. Some were advertisements from office supply companies. Others came from banks offering business credit cards. Whenever Ethan visited, he'd gather the envelopes from my kitchen counter. "Thanks," he'd say. "I'll get these out of your way." I never looked at them. Why would I? I trusted my son. Months passed. Then another year. The business appeared to be thriving. Ethan bought a newer pickup truck. Vanessa posted vacation photos from Florida. They remodeled their own kitchen. Lily transferred into a private middle school. Whenever I complimented Ethan on how well things were going, he'd grin. "It's been a lot of hard work." "I know it has. I'm finally getting ahead." Those words made me proud. Until the mail slowly began to change. The colorful advertisements disappeared. Instead, plain white envelopes arrived. Certified mail, priority mail, official-looking envelopes with windows showing company logos. I remember the first time one caught my attention. Across the top were the words, "Payment Reminder." I frowned. When Ethan stopped by that weekend, I handed it to him. "I think this looks important." He barely glanced at it. "Oh," he laughed. "Accounting mistake." "You sure happens all the time." He tucked it under his arm. "Nothing to worry about." I believed him. A few weeks later came another envelope. Then another. Then another. One mentioned insurance. One came from a materials supplier. Another carried the logo of the Internal Revenue Service. That one made me pause. When Ethan collected it, I asked again, "Everything okay?" He sighed dramatically. "You know how government paperwork is." "I suppose. My accountant already handled it." I nodded. "I don't understand those things anyway." "Exactly." He kissed my forehead. "I've got it under control." Those became his favorite words. "I've got it under control." Whenever I asked, whenever I worried, whenever another envelope appeared. Eventually I stopped asking. Not because I stopped caring. Because I didn't want him to think I doubted him. Parents never stop wanting their children to believe in themselves. Sometimes we mistake silence for support. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs lined up like dominoes. Ethan never wanted me opening the envelopes. He always picked them up immediately. If I mentioned one during a phone call, he'd drive over that same evening. Sometimes he'd arrive after 9 o'clock at night. I was nearby. No, he wasn't. I understand that now. He came because he couldn't risk another day with those letters sitting inside my house. The mailbox slowly became part of his routine. He checked it almost as often as I did. If I happened to bring the mail inside before he arrived, he'd casually ask, "Anything come for me?" At the time, it seemed harmless. Now it feels painfully obvious. Margaret noticed it before I did. One afternoon while we were planting flowers along my front walkway, she looked toward my mailbox. "Ethan gets a lot of mail here." "He uses my address for work." She raised an eyebrow. "Still," I shrugged. "I guess he hasn't found another office yet." She looked thoughtful but said nothing. Neither did I. Because I didn't want to imagine my son had forgotten his promise. Or worse, broken it. By the beginning of the 4th year, I couldn't remember the last time Ethan had mentioned moving his business. I finally asked him over dinner, "So, where's your office now?" "Oh, we've got warehouse space." "Then why are you still using my address?" He hesitated. "Only for a second. It's easier." "Easier." "The paperwork's already there." He smiled. "I'll change it eventually." Eventually. Such a harmless word. It sounded temporary. It sounded responsible. It sounded reasonable. I accepted it without another question. If I had insisted that night, if I had demanded he file the paperwork immediately, if I had opened just one of those envelopes, perhaps none of what came later would have happened. But mothers don't usually expect danger to arrive inside letters addressed to their own homes. Sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with one enormous lie. Sometimes it begins with one small favor. That quietly overstays its welcome. I couldn't explain why, but after that conversation with Ethan, I stopped throwing his mail away. Not because I suspected him of anything terrible. Not yet. It was simply a feeling I couldn't shake. For years, whenever an envelope arrived with his company's name on it, I would place it neatly on the little oak table beside my front door. If Ethan happened to visit, he'd tuck the stack under his arm before leaving. If he didn't stop by, he'd text me. Mom, did anything come for me today? If I answered yes, he'd usually appear before sunset. Looking back, I should have asked myself why a successful businessman seemed so anxious about his mail. Instead, I told myself he was simply organized. That illusion lasted until 3 days after I received the 17th collection notice. The next envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. Unlike the others, this one was thicker. The paper felt heavier. Across the top were bold red letters. Final notice before legal action. I stared at it longer than I should have. Something inside me whispered that I shouldn't hand it over unopened. For the first time in 4 years, I turned the envelope over in my hands. It wasn't addressed to Ethan personally. It was addressed to Aldridge Premier Renovations, LLC. Below the company name sat my address, my home. I ran my thumb across the sealed flap. My heart pounded. I knew opening someone else's mail wasn't something to take lightly, but this wasn't simply someone else's mail anymore. It had my address, my mailbox, my home. If creditors believed this business operated here, then somehow I had become part of a story I didn't understand. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a demand for nearly $38,000. Construction materials, unpaid invoices, late penalties, attorney fees. I read every page twice, then a third time. The debt had existed for almost 11 months. 11 months. All that time, Ethan had visited my house, smiled at me across my kitchen table, hugged me goodbye, and never mentioned any of it. I slid the papers back into the envelope just as my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. Anything come today? I looked at the message for nearly a minute. Then for the first time, I didn't answer. Instead, I carried the letter into my dining room and laid it on the table. By evening, there were already 16 other envelopes beside it. I hadn't realized how many had accumulated. One by one, I arranged them according to their postmark dates. At first, they looked random, different companies, different logos, different colors. But after nearly an hour, a pattern began to emerge. The earliest letters came from banks, then suppliers, then insurance companies. Later came tax notices. Finally, collection agencies. Each envelope represented another step downward. It was like watching someone slowly sink beneath the surface of a lake. I reached for the oldest unopened envelope. Inside was an approval notice for a commercial credit account. 6 months later, another envelope thanked Aldridge Premier Renovations for purchasing equipment. A few months after that came notices reminding Ethan about missed payments. Then warnings. Then default notices. Each envelope felt like another chapter in a story I had never been invited to read. By the time I finished sorting them, my dining room table looked like an accountant's office. I made coffee. It had grown cold before I remembered to drink it. Friday morning brought another surprise. A white SUV pulled into my driveway just after 10 o'clock. A man wearing a navy jacket stepped out carrying a leather folder. He looked to be in his early 50s, professional, calm, not threatening. He rang the bell. When I opened the door, he smiled politely. Mrs. Constance Aldridge. Yes. My name is Nathan Brooks. He handed me a business card. I'm a senior debt investigator. My stomach tightened. I'm afraid there must be some mistake. I hope so. His voice remained gentle. I'm trying to verify the operating address for Aldridge Premier Renovations. I don't own that business. I understand. That's my son's company. Nathan made a small note. Does he operate from here? No. Has he ever? Never. When was the last time he used this property as an office? He never has. Nathan looked genuinely puzzled. May I ask another question? Of course. Has your son been receiving business mail here? For several years. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Several years. He told me it was temporary. Nathan became unusually quiet. He looked toward my mailbox, then back at me. I don't want to alarm you, Mrs. Aldridge. I'm already alarmed. He nodded sympathetically. I understand. He opened his folder but stopped before removing anything. I'm limited in what I can discuss. I appreciate that. But I can tell you this. He lowered his voice. You should keep every piece of correspondence that arrives. I blinked. Every letter. Every single one. Why? I'm afraid I can't answer that. Am I in legal trouble? His answer came immediately. At this moment, I don't believe you're the person we're concerned about. That sentence should have comforted me. Instead, it terrified me. Because if investigators weren't interested in me, they were interested in Ethan. Nathan thanked me for my time and walked back toward his SUV. Halfway there, he stopped. He turned around. Mrs. Aldridge. Yes. If anyone asks you to destroy old business mail. He paused. Don't. Then he drove away. I stood in my doorway for several minutes, unable to move. That evening, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. Just as he always had. He carried takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. Thought we'd have dinner together. He smiled. The same warm smile. The same friendly voice. The same son I'd loved all his life. But something had changed. For the first time, I looked at him and wondered how many secrets could hide behind such familiar eyes. While he unpacked the food, I watched him glance toward the oak table beside my front door. His smile faded for just an instant. Did anything come today? There it was again. Not how are you, not how was your day, not even how have you been. His first concern. The mail. I answered carefully. A few things. He looked relieved. I'll grab them before I leave. Instead of speaking, I studied him. Tiny details I'd ignored for years suddenly stood out. The dark circles beneath his eyes. The way he checked his phone every few minutes. How quickly he changed the subject whenever work came up. Even during dinner, he seemed distracted. Halfway through the meal, I asked quietly, Ethan. Yeah. Is the business doing all right? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a sip of iced tea, then smiled. We've had a few slow months. That's all. Construction's unpredictable, I suppose. We'll bounce back. He said it confidently. Too confidently. Then he looked directly into my eyes. Mom. Yes. You trust me, don't you? The question caught me completely off guard. I forced a smile. Of course I do. He nodded almost as if he'd been waiting for that answer. Good. After dinner, he gathered every business envelope from the table. Every single one. Except one. The final notice I'd already opened. It was still lying inside my desk drawer. He never realized it was missing. As I watched his truck disappear down the street that night, I opened the drawer again. I read the letter one more time. Then I whispered something I never imagined I would say about my own son. What aren't you telling me, Ethan? For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the collection letters anymore. I was afraid of the answers they were slowly revealing. Sleep abandoned me that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with Ethan about his business. Every promise, every reassuring smile, every gentle laugh when I questioned another envelope. It's just paperwork, Mom. Everything's under control. Don't worry about it. Those words echoed through the darkness until dawn. For the first time since Richard died, my house no longer felt like a place of comfort. Every room seemed filled with unanswered questions. When morning finally came, I carried the unopened stack of business mail into my dining room again. I wasn't looking for proof that my son had lied. I was looking for proof that he hadn't. But hope becomes harder to hold when facts begin piling up. I spread every envelope across the table according to date, then began reading each one carefully. Some contained invoices, others were payment reminders. Several included copies of signed contracts. One supplier claimed Ethan owed more than $40,000 for roofing materials. Another demanded payment for industrial equipment. A third threatened to cancel insurance coverage because premiums hadn't been paid in months. Every letter told a slightly different story. Together, they painted one enormous picture. Ethan wasn't dealing with one financial problem. I was juggling dozens. I reached for a yellow legal pad and started writing. Company names, account numbers, dates, amounts owed. By lunchtime, I'd filled 3 pages. What troubled me most wasn't the money. It was the timing. Many of the debts stretched back nearly 2 years. 2 years. That meant Ethan had been sitting in my living room every Sunday afternoon drinking coffee with me, talking about Lily's soccer games and family vacations, while creditors were already chasing him. How had he managed to smile through all of it? Around 1 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Margaret Ellis stood outside holding a blueberry pie. "I figured you could use some company." I smiled weakly. "You always know." She followed me into the kitchen before noticing the dining room table. "Connie." She hadn't called me Connie since high school. Whenever she used that nickname, I knew she was worried. "What happened?" I hesitated. Then I surprised myself. I told her everything. From the first request to use my address, to the collection notices, to Nathan Brooks visiting my house, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the mountain of papers covering the table. "Have you shown any of this to Ethan?" "Not yet." "Good. You think so?" "I think you need answers before you ask questions." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If Ethan has been lying for years," she chose her words carefully, "he'll probably lie again." That possibility hadn't occurred to me, because mothers rarely imagine interviewing their own children. Margaret reached toward one envelope. "May I?" I nodded. She opened a payment demand and read silently. Then another. Then another. Finally, she stopped. "Connie." "What?" "Look at these signatures." I leaned closer. Each contract included a signature line for Ethan. Most looked identical, but one page contained something unexpected. Beneath Ethan's signature appeared another name. Emergency contact. I froze. The name typed underneath was mine. Constance Aldridge. My home address followed. So did my phone number. My hands started trembling. I never agreed to this. "I know. I've never even seen this paperwork." Margaret studied the page again. "It doesn't say you're financially responsible. But my name is there." "Yes. And if something happened..." Neither of us finished the sentence. For the first time, I realized creditors might have believed I knew everything. Or worse, that I approved of it. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just practical. If Ethan's company was legally connected to my address, I wanted to know exactly how. The clerk behind the counter couldn't have been older than 30. She searched the business registration database. "Yes, ma'am." She turned her monitor slightly. "Aldridge Premier Renovations." She clicked another screen. "This is the registered principal business address." There it was. My house. The place Richard and I bought 43 years earlier. The same house where Ethan learned to ride a bicycle. The same kitchen where he'd blown out birthday candles every year growing up. Now officially listed as the headquarters of a company drowning in debt. "When was this filed?" I asked. The clerk checked again. "Originally 4 years ago." "And has it ever been updated?" She shook her head. "No." I swallowed hard. What if the business moved? The owner is required to report any address change. So, if the address changed and wasn't reported, she shrugged gently, the public record remains the same. I thanked her and walked slowly back to my car. The steering wheel felt unusually cold beneath my hands. I sat there nearly 10 minutes without starting the engine. Ethan hadn't simply forgotten. He'd left my address on official government records for 4 years. That wasn't an accident anymore. That was a decision. When I arrived home, another envelope waited inside my mailbox. This one came from a commercial lender. I opened it immediately. Halfway through reading, my breath caught. Attached behind the payment demand was a copy of the original loan application. Apparently, the lender had included supporting documents because legal proceedings were about to begin. I scanned the pages: business income, equipment inventory, insurance certificates. Then, a familiar name appeared. Property contact, Constance Aldridge, again. But this time something else caught my eye. A signature. Not Ethan's. Mine. At least. Someone had tried to make it look like mine. I stared at it for several long seconds. The handwriting resembled mine just enough to fool someone who didn't know me. But I knew every curve of my own signature. I had signed thousands of report cards during my years as a librarian, thousands of retirement forms, medical documents, bank papers, birthday cards. This wasn't my handwriting. The capital C leaned too far forward. The loop in the A was too narrow. The final flourish curved in the wrong direction. Someone had copied my name. Poorly. I felt physically sick. By evening, I had only one thought. I needed legal advice. Not because I wanted to accuse my son, because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining what I was seeing. The following morning, I called the number Margaret had found for Daniel Pierce, a local attorney who specialized in consumer protection and financial fraud. His receptionist offered me an appointment that afternoon. When I arrived, Daniel greeted me with a calm smile and invited me into his office. I understand you have some concerns about business documents. I placed the folder on his desk. I'm afraid I have more than concerns. For nearly an hour, he read every page without speaking. Occasionally, he made notes. Sometimes he adjusted his glasses and reread a paragraph. Finally, he looked up. Mrs. Aldridge. His voice had become much more serious. Did you personally sign any of these documents? No. Have you ever authorized your son to sign on your behalf? Never. He nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. My heart skipped. What does that mean? He slid one document toward me. Look closely. I did. This signature doesn't match the others. I know. It also doesn't match the signature on your driver's license. I looked up. You checked? I always verify. He folded his hands together. I'm not making a final legal conclusion today. But, in my professional opinion, he paused just long enough for my stomach to tighten. There are strong indications that your signature may have been forged. The room suddenly felt smaller. I stared at the papers scattered across his desk. Every collection letter, every invoice, every notice, every excuse Ethan had ever given me. None of them frightened me as much as those 3 words. Your signature, forged. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped asking myself whether Ethan was hiding financial trouble. Instead, one far more painful question took its place. How many times had my own son been willing to write my name without ever asking for my permission? I drove home from Daniel Pierce's office with the windows rolled down, even though the October air had turned cold. I needed the wind against my face, needed something stronger than my own thoughts. The words, strong indications that your signature may have been forged, refused to leave my mind. At every red light, I replayed Ethan's face from countless family dinners. His easy smile, his calm voice, the way he always looked me straight in the eye. How could someone who had learned honesty around my kitchen table become a man capable of writing his own mother's name on legal documents? By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had already begun to sink behind the maple trees. My mailbox stood exactly where it always had. White, ordinary, harmless. Yet I found myself staring at it as though it were the source of every problem in my life. Inside waited 3 more envelopes, 2 advertisements, 1 certified letter addressed to Ethan's company. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I carried everything inside and locked the front door. For the first time in years, I checked every window in my house before turning on the lights. I wasn't afraid of strangers. I was afraid of the truth. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. Ethan. His name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning. Morning, Mom. His voice sounded cheerful. Almost too cheerful. I was thinking about stopping by tonight. Tonight? Yeah. A brief pause. Anything come in the mail? There it was again. Not how are you? Not did you sleep well? Always the mail. I looked toward the unopened certified envelope lying on my kitchen counter. A few things. Business stuff. I haven't looked. Another pause. I'll come after work. That's fine. See you around 6. He hung up before I could say anything else. I stared at the phone for several seconds. Then I called Daniel. I think I need to confront him. No. His answer came immediately. Not yet. I can't keep pretending. You've already waited 4 years. I know. Give me 48 more hours. Why? I'm requesting copies of several filings. What kind of filings? The kind that may answer questions before emotions get involved. I sighed. I hate feeling like I'm investigating my own child. I understand. But facts first. Feelings later. I agreed. Mostly because I didn't know what else to do. That afternoon, Margaret Ellis came over carrying sandwiches. She took one look at my face. You didn't sleep. Not much. We sat at the kitchen table. The pile of letters remained untouched in the dining room. Neither of us mentioned them at first. Instead, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, the church bake sale, her grandson's baseball tournament. It almost felt normal. Then she quietly asked, "What are you going to say when Ethan gets here tonight?" I honestly don't know. You've already decided not to tell him about the attorney. I nodded. I want to hear what he'll say without knowing what I know. Margaret reached across the table. That's probably wise. I hope so. But it's going to hurt. She squeezed my hand. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. Around 5:30, I heard Ethan's truck pull into the driveway. I looked through the living room window. His truck was spotless. Brand new tires, fresh company decals. If someone had seen it parked outside a construction site, they would have assumed the business was thriving. He walked inside carrying a bakery box. Your favorite cinnamon rolls. He smiled exactly as he always had. For one dangerous moment, I almost believed nothing had changed. Then his eyes drifted toward the kitchen counter, toward the certified envelope. So, he tried to sound casual. Anything important today? I picked up the envelope but didn't hand it over. I haven't opened it. You don't need to. He reached for it. I'll take care of it. Instead of letting go, I held the envelope a little tighter. Ethan. His smile weakened. Yeah. How's business? He laughed softly. Busy. Busy enough? Of course. I've been getting a lot of collection notices. His shoulders stiffened. They send those automatically. Automatically, computer systems. They don't mean much. I looked directly at him. One of them says you owe nearly $40,000. His expression barely changed. You opened it. I did. For the first time in years, silence filled the room between us. Finally, he shrugged. I wish you hadn't. I wish you had told me. It's complicated. Then explain it. He rubbed the back of his neck. You know how construction works. I don't. Payments come late. So, sometimes suppliers get impatient. That doesn't explain lawsuits. His eyes narrowed slightly. Who's been talking to you? No one. Mom. I'm asking because I'm worried. You don't need to worry. I think I do. He walked toward the refrigerator, opened it, and grabbed a bottle of water. He took a long drink before speaking again. We've got cash tied up in projects. For 2 years. He froze. Only for a fraction of a second. But I saw it. The surprise. You've been reading all the letters. It wasn't a question. No. I've been reading enough. He set the bottle down harder than necessary. I told you I'd handle it. I've waited 4 years for you to handle it. His jaw tightened. I never asked you to read my business mail. You asked to use my address. That's different. No, Ethan. My voice remained calm. It's exactly the same. He stared at me, then looked away. I'll change the address. When? This week. You said that last year. I mean it this time. I took a slow breath. Did you ever put my name on business paperwork? His head snapped toward me. What? My name? No. Are you sure? Yes. Absolutely. He hesitated. A tiny hesitation. Less than a second. But after weeks of watching him, I noticed everything now. I may have listed you as an emergency contact. Only that's normal. Nothing else. No. His answer came too quickly. I held his gaze. Ethan, what if I find out you've been lying to me? He interrupted before I finished. I'm not lying. His voice rose for the first time. I'm trying to save my business. By hiding things from your mother. I'm protecting you. Those words hit me harder than shouting would have. Protecting me. You'd only worry. I am worried. I didn't want that. You've given me 17 reasons to worry. His face hardened. You've been counting. I've been learning. He shook his head in frustration. This is exactly why I kept business away from family. I wasn't part of your business. You didn't have to become part of it. The sentence escaped before I could stop it. His expression changed. Confusion, then caution. For one terrifying moment, I nearly told him everything. About Daniel, about the signatures, about Nathan Brooks. Instead, I simply said, "It means my home has stopped feeling like my home." Neither of us spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Finally, Ethan sighed. "I'm under a lot of pressure." "I know. I'm trying to fix everything." "I hope you are." "I will." He picked up the certified envelope. This time I let go. He tucked it under his arm. I should get home. As he reached the front door, I asked one last question. "Ethan." He turned. "When was the last time you told me the whole truth?" He didn't answer. Instead, he forced a tired smile. "I love you, Mom." Then he walked outside. I stood at the window until his truck disappeared around the corner. Something about that conversation kept bothering me. Not what he had said, what he hadn't. He never denied using my address. He never denied the debts. He never even seemed surprised that creditors were contacting me. The only thing that truly unsettled him was the possibility that I had started reading the letters. That night, I opened my notebook again. Across the top of a clean page, I wrote a single sentence. Ethan isn't afraid of the debt. I stared at the words for a long time. Then underneath them, I added another. For the next 2 days, I barely heard from Ethan. That alone was unusual. Normally, he called at least once every evening, sometimes for only a few minutes, just to ask how I was doing or remind me about some family gathering. But after our conversation, his messages became shorter. "Busy today. Talk later. Hope you're doing okay." There wasn't a single mention of the business, not one question about the mail. It was almost as if he was waiting to see what I would do next. I spent those quiet days organizing every document Daniel Pierce had asked me to preserve. My dining room had transformed into something between a home office and an evidence room. I purchased colored folders from the office supply store and labeled them carefully. Banks, suppliers, tax notices, insurance, collection agencies, legal correspondence. Each stack grew taller than the last. I couldn't help noticing another disturbing pattern. Every few months, the return addresses changed. Different banks, different lenders, different suppliers. But Ethan's company remained the same. It was as though he kept replacing one creditor with another, never solving the problem, only delaying it. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel called. "I received the business filings. Did you find anything?" "I found several things." His voice sounded unusually measured. "Can you come by my office tomorrow morning? Is it bad? I'd rather show you in person." That answer stayed with me all night. The next morning, I arrived 15 minutes early. Daniel welcomed me into his conference room instead of his office. A thick binder sat in the middle of the table. "I've requested everything that's publicly available." He opened the binder. "Business registrations." He turned another page. "Annual reports." Another. "Commercial financing statements." Then another. "Loan filings." I stared at page after page bearing Ethan's company name. So much paperwork. "There usually is." Daniel slid one document toward me. "This is the original business registration." I recognized my address immediately. "What changed?" I asked. "Nothing." "What do you mean?" "The address never changed." "I already knew that." "Look closer." Near the bottom of the page was a section labeled Registered Agent Contact Information. Again, my name, my home phone number, my address. "I never filled this out." "I know." He flipped several more pages. "Now look at the annual reports." Every year. The same information. Every single year. Someone had renewed the registration. Someone had confirmed that my house remained the official address. Someone had signed each filing. I felt a chill. He had to update these every year, correct? So this wasn't something he forgot. Daniel shook his head. No. He actively confirmed it. Yes. The realization landed like a stone. For 4 years, Ethan hadn't simply neglected to change the address. Every year he had chosen, again, to leave my home connected to his business. I covered my mouth with one hand. I kept making excuses for him. Most parents would. I told myself he was overwhelmed. Daniel nodded kindly. People don't usually expect deception from family. He opened another section. This part concerns me even more. There were copies of financing applications, commercial equipment loans, vehicle financing, lines of credit, one after another. Each application listed the same business address, my house. One document included photographs of construction equipment. Another listed company vehicles. A third referenced warehouse inventory. I frowned. Ethan told me they rented warehouse space. They probably did. Then why use my address? Daniel leaned back. Because a permanent residential address can sometimes make communication easier. For whom? For the business owner. I didn't understand. He continued. If the warehouse lease changes, the mailing address doesn't. If creditors visit, they come here first. My stomach tightened. So my home became. He finished the sentence quietly. The place where everyone looked before they looked for Ethan. That thought made me physically ill. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Margaret watering my flowers. She immediately noticed my expression. Worse. I nodded. He renewed the address every year. Her watering can stopped in midair. Every year. It wasn't an oversight. She slowly set the can down. Oh, Connie. I told her everything Daniel had shown me. She listened silently. Finally, she asked, "What are you going to do now?" I honestly don't know. Before I could answer further, another car pulled into my driveway. A silver SUV, not Ethan's. A young girl stepped out first. Lily. She looked nervous. Vanessa remained behind the wheel. The engine stayed running. Lily walked slowly toward the porch. Grandma. I smiled immediately. Sweetheart. She hugged me tightly, longer than usual. When she finally stepped back, she glanced toward her mother's SUV. Can I talk to you? Of course. Vanessa waved politely from inside the vehicle, but didn't get out. Lily followed me into the living room. She stood quietly for nearly a minute. What is it? She twisted the sleeve of her sweatshirt around her fingers. Dad says you're upset. I've been worried. He says everything's going to be okay. I hope he's right. She looked down at the floor, then whispered, I don't think he believes that. My heart skipped. What makes you say that? He doesn't sleep anymore. I stayed silent. He walks around the house at night. She swallowed hard. Sometimes he talks on the phone. About work. She nodded. I hear people yelling. What kind of yelling? They want money. The room suddenly felt much colder. Lily continued speaking before I could respond. Mom tells me to stay upstairs. But I still hear them. I reached for her hand. You don't have to worry about grown-up problems. I already do. There was a maturity in those 5 words no 13-year-old should have possessed. She looked toward the front window, making sure her mother couldn't hear. Then she leaned closer. Grandma? Yes. Dad keeps boxes in the garage. What kind of boxes? Files. My pulse quickened. He gets really mad if anyone touches them. I remembered Ethan's spotless garage. Every tool hanging perfectly on the wall. Everything organized. Except apparently, those boxes. What else? Lily hesitated. I wasn't supposed to hear this. You won't get in trouble. Last week, Dad told Mom. She stopped again. What did he say? She lowered her voice until it was barely above a whisper. As long as Mom's address stays on everything, we still have time. My heart seemed to stop. I stared at my granddaughter. You're sure? She nodded. I heard him. When? The night before you came over for dinner. Every word echoed inside my head. As long as Mom's address stays on everything, Not our address, not the business address, my address. Lily looked frightened by my silence. Did I do something wrong? I wrapped my arms around her. No. You promise. I promise. You won't tell Dad I said anything. I closed my eyes. I won't. She relaxed slightly. After a few minutes, Vanessa honked the horn outside. Lily hugged me again before walking toward the door. Just before stepping outside, she turned around. There are more boxes now. What? In the garage. How many? I don't know. She thought for a moment. But Dad moved them after the bank called. Then she hurried back to the SUV. I stood on the porch watching them drive away. The afternoon sun felt strangely distant. My notebook still lay open on the dining room table. I picked up my pen. Under yesterday's sentence, he's afraid of what I'll discover next. I wrote something new. Hi isn't using my address because it's convenient. I paused, then finished the thought. He's using it because it's buying him time. For the first time, I realized this wasn't simply a story about debt. It was a story about delay. Every letter that came to my mailbox was one less day a creditor spent knocking on Ethan's own door. And somehow, my home had become the shield behind which my son was hiding. He's afraid of what I'll discover next. After Lily left, I sat alone in my living room for nearly an hour without turning on the television. The house was perfectly quiet, too quiet. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the front yard, gathering along the sidewalk. Richard had poured himself more than 40 years ago. I watched them through the picture window, trying to steady my breathing. As long as Mom's address stays on everything, we still have time. Those words refused to leave me, not because they were cruel, because they sounded calculated. Ethan hadn't been clinging to my address out of laziness. He had been depending on it. The difference mattered. I walked into the dining room and opened the notebook where I'd been documenting everything. Every conversation, every letter, every date, every promise. Another page was nearly full. I added Lily's exact words, writing them as carefully as I could remember. Then I circled one phrase 3 times. We still have time. Time for what? To finish projects, to pay creditors, to move money, to disappear. I hated myself for even thinking such things. This was my son. The little boy who used to crawl into our bed after thunderstorms. The teenager who cried at his father's funeral because he thought he had to become the man of the house. The young father who once called me in tears the day Lily was born because he'd never felt so terrified and happy at the same time. How had that man become someone who measured his future by hiding behind his mother's address? The next morning, my phone rang just after 9. It was Daniel Pierce. I've been reviewing more documents. What did you find? I'd like you to come in. I was there yesterday. I know. His voice remained calm. But this can't wait. Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from him again. This time, another folder rested on his desk. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he asked a question. Mrs. Aldridge, have you ever guaranteed one of Ethan's business loans? No. Have you ever attended a meeting at his bank? Never. Have you ever spoken with one of his lenders? I don't think so. He nodded. Good. Why? Because that makes today's discovery easier to understand. He slid a document toward me. Across the top, I read the words, Commercial Line of Credit Renewal. The lender's name was unfamiliar. The amount wasn't. Nearly $300,000. I don't understand. Look halfway down. I found the section he indicated. Business mailing address, my home. Again. Then Daniel pointed farther down. Primary contact for correspondence, Constance Aldridge. My name, not Ethan's, mine. I never agreed to this. I know. I've never even heard of this bank. I believe you. He opened another file. This one is from a different lender. The same thing. Another bank. Another loan. Another application. My address. My name. Different paperwork. Same pattern. I counted silently. 1. Daniel nodded. Keep going. 2. He handed me another. 3. Then another. 4. My hands started trembling. How many are there? So far. He looked at his notes. 7 separate lending relationships. 7. 7. I leaned back in my chair. 7 different banks believed they could contact me if they couldn't reach Ethan. No wonder my mailbox had become a battlefield. Daniel folded his hands. There's something else. I looked up. The banks don't appear to believe you guaranteed these loans. Relief washed over me. Thank goodness. But there was always a but. They clearly believed you knew where the business operated. I frowned. Why does that matter? Because if creditors can't locate a company, they start where official records send them. My house. Exactly. I suddenly understood Nathan Brooks' first visit. He hadn't come because he suspected me. He came because every official document led straight to my front door. Daniel closed the folder. I'd like to speak with one of the lenders directly. Can you do that? With your permission. Of course. There's one person I think may be willing to talk. Who? Grace Holloway. He handed me a business card. She's a regional commercial banking manager. What does she know? I don't know yet. But she approved one of Ethan's early credit lines. That afternoon, Grace agreed to meet us. Her office occupied the 4th floor of a downtown Columbus office building. She greeted us professionally but warmly. Mrs. Aldridge. She shook my hand. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. So am I. We sat in a small conference room. Grace opened a file. I have to be careful about what I disclose. I understand. But I can answer certain questions. Daniel spoke first. Did the bank believe Mrs. Aldridge owned Aldridge Premier Renovations? No. Did the bank believe she guaranteed the loan? No. I relaxed slightly. Grace continued. But we absolutely believed the registered business address was legitimate. She looked directly at me. We mailed every important notice there. I received many of them. So it seems. Grace turned another page. Early on, Ethan's company had an excellent payment history. Really? She nodded. For nearly 18 months. That surprised me. So he wasn't always struggling? No. What happened? Grace sighed. The company expanded too quickly. She pointed to a chart. First came new trucks. Then another line. Additional employees. Another. Equipment leases. Another. Warehouse space. Then finally, multiple overlapping projects. He borrowed to grow. Yes. And when projects slowed, the debt remained. Grace looked genuinely disappointed. It happens more often than people realize. I found myself asking the question that had haunted me for weeks. If his business started failing, why didn't anyone tell me? Grace hesitated. Because officially, she tapped the file. You weren't the borrower. Then why keep sending letters here? Because this was the only verified business address. The answer felt painfully simple. Not malicious, not complicated, just devastating. On the drive home, Daniel remained thoughtful. What are you thinking? I asked. Ethan. What about him? He didn't begin as a criminal. I looked at him. He began as an optimistic businessman. Then what changed? Daniel watched the traffic ahead. Sometimes people convince themselves they're only borrowing time. Until borrowing time becomes living a lie. That evening I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Borrowing time. Maybe that's exactly what Ethan believed he was doing. Maybe every new loan was supposed to save the previous one. Maybe every delayed payment was meant to last only until the next project finished. Maybe every collection letter represented another promise he'd made to himself. I'll fix it next month. I'll pay everyone back. Mom never has to know. But intentions don't erase consequences. As sunset painted the sky orange outside my kitchen window, another envelope slid through my mail slot. I picked it up automatically. This one came from a bank I'd never seen before. Inside was a notice stating that Ethan's commercial account had been frozen pending further review. Attached to the letter was a list of business contacts. My eyes moved slowly down the page. Owner, Ethan Aldridge. Business address. My house. Emergency contact. My name. Then I reached the final line. Relationship manager, assigned Grace Holloway. I immediately understood why Grace had looked so saddened that afternoon. She hadn't simply approved one loan. She had watched Ethan's business slowly collapse from the inside, and every warning she'd ever mailed had come to me. Not because I was responsible, because someone had made sure they did. I carefully placed the newest letter on top of the growing stack. There were so many now that they no longer fit inside a single folder. Each envelope revealed another piece of Ethan's decisions, another layer of his fear, another reason he couldn't afford for me to start reading them. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped asking whether Ethan could still save his business. Instead, I found myself wondering something far more painful. How long had my son known that he wasn't trying to save his company anymore? Only delay the day it finally collapsed. After my meeting with Grace Holloway, I stopped looking at the collection letters as isolated problems. Instead, I began treating them like pieces of a puzzle. For days, my dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of envelopes, loan statements, invoices, payment reminders, and legal notices. I bought a large corkboard from a craft store, several packs of colored pushpins, and enough string to make Margaret laugh. "You look like one of those detectives on television," she joked as she carried in 2 cups of coffee. "I wish this were television," I replied. "Then someone would solve it in 45 minutes." She smiled sadly. "I don't think anyone envies the role you're playing." Neither did I. I pinned every document to the board according to its date. Blue pins represented bank loans. Red pins marked collection agencies. Green pins were supplier invoices. Yellow pins identified legal notices. When I stepped back, the board looked chaotic. But after several hours, the chaos slowly became a timeline. That timeline changed everything. The first loan appeared 4 years earlier. Nothing unusual. Then came another 6 months later. Still understandable. A growing business often borrowed money. But the third loan arrived only 4 months after that. Then a fourth. Then equipment leases. Then overdue invoices. Then collection letters. It wasn't just the financial pattern that caught my attention. It was what had been happening in our family during those same months. I opened an old photo album from my bookshelf. There was Ethan smiling proudly beside his brand new pickup truck. I checked the date on the photograph. The same month he had signed a new equipment loan. Another page showed our family at Disney World with Lily. Vanessa had insisted on renting one of the resort's larger suites because, according to Ethan, business has been incredible this year. I looked at the date. Only 3 weeks after a supplier had sent its first overdue notice. I turned another page. Christmas morning. Everyone laughing. Vanessa wearing a diamond necklace Ethan had proudly presented after dinner. I remembered how embarrassed he seemed when I asked if it had been expensive. "Business has been good, Mom." Again. I checked the timeline. That same month, 2 different lenders had mailed default notices to my house. My stomach tightened. I wasn't just looking at debt anymore. I was looking at a double life. The life Ethan showed his family, and the life hidden inside my mailbox. Margaret stood beside me quietly. "You see it now, don't you?" I nodded. He wasn't hiding one bad month. No. He was hiding an entire lifestyle. She rested a hand on my shoulder. "That's a terrible burden." "It gets worse." I pointed to another section of the board. Every time Ethan made what appeared to be a major purchase, another loan followed within weeks. The truck, the family vacation, the warehouse lease, the private school tuition, the kitchen renovation. The timeline didn't suggest success. It suggested borrowed money, borrowed hope, borrowed appearances. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa. How much did she know? Had she believed Ethan's explanations? Or had she chosen not to ask questions because she enjoyed the comfortable life they seemed to have built? The following afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Vanessa's name. That surprised me. She almost never called me directly. "Hello? Constance." Her voice sounded tired. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all. I was wondering," she hesitated, "if I could stop by." Of course. Less than an hour later, she pulled into my driveway. She came alone. No Ethan, no Lily. When I opened the front door, I immediately noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. I don't have much time, she said quietly. Ethan thinks I'm grocery shopping. I led her into the kitchen. She looked around the house before speaking again. Has he been here? Yesterday. What did he tell you? Not much. She let out a long breath. I figured. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, she looked directly at me. Constance. Yes. I know you're receiving the letters. The words hung heavily between us. I chose my response carefully. So you know about them? She nodded. I've known for a while. My heart sank. How long? I don't know exactly. A year. Maybe longer. I stared at her. You never told me. I wanted to. Then why didn't you? She lowered her eyes. Because every time I brought it up, she swallowed hard. Ethan promised he was about to fix everything. I heard those words before. Not from Vanessa. From Ethan himself. He always said one more project would solve it. She gave a sad smile. Then another project. And another. And another. Tears filled her eyes. I believed him. Did you know he was still using my address? She nodded almost imperceptibly. I knew. You never asked him to stop. I did. What happened? He said changing it would confuse the banks. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded exactly like Ethan. Always another explanation. Always another reason to wait. Vanessa looked toward the dining room. May I see them? The letters. She nodded. I led her to the corkboard. She stood silently for nearly a minute. Then she covered her mouth. I didn't know there were this many. There are more in boxes. Her shoulders slumped. Oh, Ethan. She slowly traced one line of string connecting 3 different loans. I remember this. What? This was when he bought the new truck. She moved to another section. And this, her voice cracked. This was our Florida vacation. Another. This one paid for Lily's tuition. I looked at her carefully. You really didn't know. I knew we were borrowing. She wiped away a tear. I didn't know we were drowning. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something unexpected. Not anger toward Vanessa, pity. She had believed the same promises I had, only she lived with them every day. I should have asked more questions, she whispered. So should I. She shook her head. No. You trusted your son. I trusted my husband. Neither of us had been rewarded for that trust. Before leaving, Vanessa hesitated near the front door. There's something else. I waited. Ethan has been trying to sell equipment. Recently, she nodded, but nobody wants to pay what he owes. I frowned. Is the business still operating? Barely. What do you mean? He keeps taking small jobs. But they don't cover the debt anymore. That sentence echoed inside me long after she left. The business wasn't failing. It had already failed. Everything afterward had been an attempt to keep the appearance of success alive. That evening, I returned to the corkboard. For the first time, I added family photographs between the financial documents. A picture of Ethan holding the keys to his truck. A picture of all of us at Disney World. Christmas morning. Lily's first day at private school. The board no longer looked like financial evidence. It looked like 2 parallel lives, one built from photographs, the other built from paperwork. Both told the same story, only one was true. As darkness settled outside my windows, I stepped back and studied the entire timeline one final time. Then I noticed something I had somehow missed before. There was one period, almost 8 consecutive months, during which Ethan hadn't made a single payment to several creditors. Yet during those exact same months, our family had celebrated birthdays, holidays, vacations, and anniversaries without the slightest hint that anything was wrong. He hadn't simply hidden the truth. He had protected the illusion with extraordinary determination. I picked up my notebook and wrote another observation beneath the others. Every celebration had a matching collection letter. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then I added one final line. The happiest memories of the past 2 years weren't built on success. They were financed by promises Ethan could no longer keep. As I closed the notebook, I realized something heartbreaking. The collection letters had never stolen my peace. The lies had. And for the first time, I wondered whether Ethan had been lying to everyone else, or whether he'd spent so long lying to himself that he no longer knew the difference. Once I accepted that Ethan's business had been surviving on borrowed money instead of real profit, I stopped asking whether he was in trouble. Instead, I began asking a different question. How had he managed to keep the illusion alive for so long? The answer, I suspected, was buried somewhere inside the numbers. Daniel Pierce agreed. The financial records tell a story, he said during our next meeting. People lie, bank statements usually don't. He had spent the previous week requesting every document Ethan's attorney was legally required to disclose during negotiations with several creditors. Some records had already become public because of pending civil claims, while others had been voluntarily provided by lenders, hoping to resolve the growing mess. Daniel spread several spreadsheets across his conference table. I've simplified them. I'm grateful, I admitted. The original paperwork looked like it was written in another language. He smiled. It feels that way to most people. He drew a line across the first page. Let's start 4 years ago. The numbers surprised me. Ethan's company had actually been healthy during its first 18 months. Revenue increased steadily. Projects were completed on time. Customers paid. Suppliers trusted him. He really was successful, I whispered. Yes. Daniel nodded. That part wasn't a lie. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Maybe everything after that had simply spiraled beyond his control. Then Daniel turned the page. This is where things changed. The company's expenses began climbing much faster than its income. A second work truck, additional employees, a warehouse lease, equipment financed through monthly payments, commercial insurance, advertising campaigns, payroll taxes. Everything expanded at once. He grew too quickly, I said. Exactly. Couldn't he simply slow down? He probably believed growth would solve the cash flow problem. Daniel circled another column. Instead, it made the problem larger. The next page showed something even more troubling. 3 separate loans had been issued within 9 months. Each one paid off part of an earlier balance. So, I hesitated. He borrowed money to pay money he already owed. Daniel looked at me. Yes. And that's when the cycle began. The room fell silent. I remembered Ethan telling me countless times that business owners constantly reinvested in themselves. I had believed him. What I hadn't understood was that reinvesting and surviving were two very different things. Daniel continued. Look at these deposits. Large amounts entered the business account. Days later, large withdrawals, checks to suppliers, payroll, vehicle payments, interest. Then almost nothing remained. He wasn't keeping the money. No. So where did it go? Into keeping everything moving. The words reminded me of someone desperately bailing water from a leaking boat. No matter how fast they worked, the water kept rising. Daniel opened another folder. This part concerns me. Inside were credit card statements connected to the business. At first, I assumed they contained construction expenses. Instead, I found hotel reservations, airline tickets, high-end restaurants, designer clothing stores, furniture, a luxury resort. I stared at the pages. There has to be some mistake. I wish there were. Business meetings. Some probably were. He pointed to one transaction. A 5-star resort in Arizona. Another. A jewelry boutique. Another. Luxury vehicle accessories. I closed my eyes. I remember that necklace. Daniel looked at me. Which necklace? The one Ethan gave Vanessa at Christmas. I could still picture her opening the velvet box. She had thrown her arms around him while everyone applauded. Richard's old dining table had been filled with laughter that evening. I remembered teasing Ethan. Business must be treating you well. He had laughed. We've been blessed. Now I knew what had really happened. The necklace hadn't been purchased after a profitable project. It had been purchased while suppliers waited to be paid. The realization hurt more than I expected, not because of the money, because that memory had always been one of my favorites. Now it felt stained. Daniel quietly slid another statement toward me. This one is even more revealing. The dates caught my attention immediately. A large commercial loan had been deposited on a Monday. By Friday, the family had paid for a week-long vacation. The following Tuesday, a collection agency had mailed its first demand letter. I slowly leaned back in my chair. He was trying to keep everything looking normal. Daniel nodded. That's common, even when it wasn't. Especially when it wasn't. As we continued reviewing records, another pattern emerged. Every time Ethan received a large payment from a customer, most of it disappeared almost immediately. Not because profits were being saved, because old debts had to be covered before new projects could continue. He was constantly running behind. Yes, but each new project gave him hope. Daniel paused. Hope can become dangerous when it replaces reality. On my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Hope. Ethan hadn't started his business intending to deceive anyone. I truly believed that. He had dreamed of building something successful, of making his father proud, of giving Lily opportunities he never had. Somewhere along the way, that dream had become something else. A trap. That evening, Margaret stopped by carrying homemade chicken soup. She found me sitting at the dining room table staring at the corkboard. You've been here all afternoon. I keep looking for the moment everything changed. She followed my gaze. Maybe there wasn't one moment. What do you mean? Sometimes people don't fall off a cliff. She pointed gently toward the board. They slide down a hill one small step at a time. I thought about that after she left. Perhaps Ethan hadn't woken up one morning planning to use my address for years. Perhaps he had simply postponed changing it, then postponed it again, then convinced himself one more month wouldn't matter, then another, until one small compromise became hundreds. Just before bedtime, my phone buzzed. It was Lily. She had never texted me directly before. Grandma, are you awake? I replied immediately. Yes, sweetheart. Is everything okay? Several minutes passed. Then another message appeared. Dad sold one of the work trucks today. I frowned. Did he say why? Another pause. He told Mom it was to help the business. Then one final message. But he looked scared, not hopeful. I set my phone down and stared into the darkness beyond my kitchen window. Selling equipment wasn't growth. It wasn't expansion. It wasn't confidence. It was survival. For the first time, I wondered whether Ethan himself had finally realized something I had only recently begun to understand. His business wasn't waiting for one lucky break. It wasn't one successful project away from recovery. It wasn't trapped because customers had disappeared. It had reached the point where selling yesterday's tools was the only way to pay yesterday's promises. I walked over to the corkboard one last time before going to bed. Without thinking, I removed a photograph of Ethan standing proudly beside his newest truck. There was no reason to keep pretending. That truck was already gone. In its place, I pinned a copy of the sales notice Daniel had obtained earlier that day. The contrast between the smiling photograph and the legal paperwork was almost unbearable. One represented the image Ethan had shown the world. The other represented the reality he had hidden from all of us. I picked up my notebook and wrote another sentence beneath the others. The business didn't collapse in a single day. It disappeared one compromise at a time. Then underneath it, I wrote the thought that frightened me most. If Ethan was now selling the very equipment he needed to work, what would he sacrifice next to keep the truth from catching him? 3 mornings later, the letter arrived that changed everything. Unlike the dozens before it, this envelope wasn't simply marked past due or final notice. Across the front in bold black letters were the words, Notice of intent to recover collateral. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a formal notification from a commercial lender stating that unless immediate arrangements were made, they intended to repossess business assets connected to Aldridge Premier Renovations. The list of collateral covered nearly 2 full pages: 2 work trucks, a trailer, industrial saws, compressors, generators, excavation equipment, office computers, even warehouse shelving. I read the inventory twice. Then I noticed something at the bottom. Official business address on file, my home. Again. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the growing binder Daniel had helped me organize. Instead of feeling shocked, I felt strangely calm. Somewhere over the previous few weeks, fear had slowly transformed into determination. I was tired of reacting. It was time to understand exactly how close everything was to collapsing. I called Daniel immediately. I received another notice. What kind? Asset recovery. His voice became serious. Can you bring it to me? I'll leave now. An hour later, we sat across from one another with the notice spread across his desk. Daniel adjusted his glasses and read every line. When he finished, he leaned back quietly. This is significant. How significant? It means one of the lenders has lost confidence. I thought they'd already lost confidence. They've lost patience. There was a difference. Confidence allowed negotiation. Patience eventually ran out. What happens now? If Ethan doesn't reach an agreement, they take the equipment. Yes. And if they take the equipment? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, a construction company without equipment rarely survives very long. The sentence settled heavily between us. I looked toward the office window. Cars moved normally through downtown Columbus. People hurried to work. Coffee shops were full. The world continued exactly as it always had. Meanwhile, my son's business stood on the edge of disappearing. Daniel opened another folder. There's something else. I looked back at him. I've been monitoring new public filings. What did you find? He slid a freshly printed document across the desk. The filing date was only 8 days old. 8, not months, days. What am I looking at? A new business registration. I frowned. But Ethan already has a company. Daniel nodded. I know. I looked more closely. The name wasn't Aldridge Premier Renovations. It was completely different. EA Property Solutions, LLC. I read it twice. Why would he create another company? Daniel answered carefully. There are legitimate reasons. And illegitimate ones. There are those too. I continued reading. Owner: Ethan Aldridge. Business category: residential property maintenance. Registered mailing address. I froze. No. No. It couldn't be. My house. Again. I slowly looked up. He did it again. Daniel nodded. He filed this less than 2 weeks ago. He promised me. I know. He looked me in the eye. I know. He said he'd change everything. Daniel remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. The document spoke for itself. While I had been sorting collection letters, while Grace had been explaining loan records, while Lily had been worrying about her father, while Vanessa had finally admitted the truth, Ethan had quietly registered another company using my address. Not years ago. Not before everything fell apart. Last week. I felt something inside me break. Not my love for my son. That remained. But something else. The last fragile piece of trust I had been desperately trying to protect. I don't understand. Daniel folded his hands. Neither do I. He knew I'd started reading the mail. Yes. He knew I'd hired you. Most likely. So why? Daniel took a long breath. Because desperate people don't always make rational decisions. I drove home in complete silence. Halfway there, my phone rang. Ethan. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. Hello? Hey, Mom. His voice sounded forced. You busy tonight? Why? I thought maybe we'd have dinner. Dinner. Yeah. It's been a while. I almost laughed. It had been 5 days, but emotionally it felt like years. I can stop by around 6. I glanced at the passenger seat where the new business registration rested inside my folder. All right. Great. I'll bring takeout. He sounded relieved. as if dinner might somehow return everything to normal. It couldn't. Not anymore. At exactly 6 o'clock, Ethan arrived carrying Chinese food from my favorite restaurant. He smiled as I opened the door. I remembered you like the sesame chicken. I do. For several minutes, we talked about harmless things: the weather, football, Lily's school play. It almost felt like old times. Almost. Then I reached into the folder beside my chair. Without saying a word, I placed the newest business registration on the table between us. Ethan looked down. His smile disappeared. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he picked up the paper. His face lost what little color remained. Where did you get this, public records? He stared at the document. I can explain. I've heard that sentence before. This isn't what you think. Then tell me what it is. He rubbed both hands across his face. I needed another company. Why? The old one. He stopped. The old one what? Has too much debt. I waited. So you started another one. It wasn't like that. You used my address again. I was going to tell you. When? He looked away. I don't know. Before or after the collection letters started arriving, his shoulders slumped. Mom. No. I interrupted him for the first time in my life. You promised. I know. You looked at me in this very room and promised. I thought I could fix everything. You've been saying that for years. I almost had. No, Ethan. I pushed the document closer to him. If you almost had, you wouldn't have needed another company. Silence filled the kitchen. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Finally, Ethan whispered, I couldn't let the business die. I looked at him. It already has. His eyes filled with tears. No. Ethan. No. I've seen the records. He shook his head harder. If I get 3 more contracts, Ethan, I can still save it. Listen to yourself. He stood abruptly. You don't understand business. No. I understand something else. What? I understand denial. He froze. You aren't fighting to save a company anymore. His breathing became uneven. You're fighting to avoid admitting it's over. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then quietly, almost like a frightened child, he asked, What if you're wrong? I looked at my son, really looked at him. The dark circles beneath his eyes. The exhaustion. The fear. The man standing in front of me wasn't arrogant. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was terrified. Terrified that if he admitted the truth, everything he'd spent years trying to protect would disappear in a single moment. His business, his reputation, his family, perhaps even his own sense of who he was. I spoke as gently as I could. Ethan. He looked up. You keep saying you're trying to save your company. Because I am. I slowly shook my head. No. I felt tears fill my own eyes. I think you're trying to save yourself from accepting that it ended a long time ago. He didn't answer. He simply lowered his head. For the first time since this nightmare began, my son had no explanation left. Only silence. And somehow, that silence frightened me more than every collection letter that had ever arrived in my mailbox. After Ethan left that evening, I didn't cry. I thought I would. I thought the moment my son walked out of my front door carrying the weight of his silence, I would collapse into the nearest chair and let weeks of fear pour out of me. Instead, I felt strangely empty. Not because I loved him less, because I had finally stopped arguing with reality. For weeks, I'd searched for an explanation that would make everything hurt a little less. A misunderstanding, a bookkeeping mistake, a dishonest employee, a temporary cash flow problem. One by one, those possibilities had disappeared. Now only the truth remained. The next morning, Daniel Pierce called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I've received notice from one of the attorneys representing the creditors. What does that mean? They're beginning formal discovery. I don't understand. They're collecting evidence. For court. Potentially. He paused. I think it's time you meet with the investigators. My stomach tightened. Am I in trouble? No. His answer came quickly. In fact, I believe your records may be what protects you. An hour later, Daniel and I arrived at a government office downtown. The building wasn't intimidating. It looked like any ordinary federal office. Clean hallways, gray carpeting, quiet voices. Still, my hands shook as we checked in. A woman in her mid-40s walked toward us carrying a legal pad. Mrs. Aldridge. Yes, she smiled warmly. I'm Detective Laura Jenkins. She shook my hand firmly. Thank you for coming. Her kindness surprised me. I'd imagined stern questions and suspicious looks. Instead, she treated me like someone who had been through enough already. We sat together in a small interview room. Laura placed a digital recorder on the table. With your permission, I'd like to document our conversation. Of course. She switched it on. Please state your full name. Constance Marie Aldridge. And your address? I gave it. The same address that had somehow become the center of Ethan's business life. Laura nodded. Mrs. Aldridge, we're trying to establish a clear timeline. I'll help however I can. Daniel placed my binder on the table. Every collection letter, every certified notice, every handwritten note I'd made, every date, every conversation I could remember. Laura's eyebrows lifted slightly. You kept all of this? I almost threw most of it away. What changed your mind? I thought about Nathan Brooks standing on my front porch weeks earlier. He told me not to destroy anything. She smiled faintly. I'm glad you listened. For nearly 2 hours we worked through the documents, one envelope at a time, one date at a time. Laura asked careful questions. When did you first allow Ethan to use your address? When did you begin receiving collection notices? Did you ever sign business paperwork? No. Did you ever guarantee loans? No. Did you receive financial benefit from his company? Never. She wrote continuously. Occasionally, Daniel pointed to a document. Occasionally, I explained where it had arrived or how Ethan had responded. When we reached the forged signatures, Laura studied them carefully. These don't appear consistent. Daniel nodded. Our handwriting specialist reached the same preliminary conclusion. The words sent another chill through me. So it wasn't just Daniel's opinion anymore. Other professionals saw the same thing. Laura closed one folder and opened another. There's something I'd like to show you. She slid several photographs across the table. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I recognized the location. Ethan's warehouse, the one he had rented nearly 3 years earlier. Shelves stood half empty. Equipment was missing. Boxes lined one wall. Laura pointed toward the photographs. These were taken during a lawful inspection. I looked closer. Several cardboard boxes had shipping labels attached. Different company names. Not just Aldridge Premier Renovations. EA Property Solutions. Another name I'd never seen. Then another. How many companies did Ethan own? Laura answered carefully. We're still determining that. The uncertainty frightened me. I had thought there were only two. Apparently no one knew for sure. She placed another photograph on the table. This one showed filing cabinets, drawer after drawer, each labeled with years, each packed with documents. I suddenly remembered what Lily had told me. Dad keeps boxes in the garage. Those weren't just boxes, they were records. Laura leaned forward. Did your granddaughter ever mention paperwork? I looked at Daniel, then back at Laura. Yes. What did she say? I hesitated. Lily had trusted me, but she also deserved to grow up in a family built on honesty. I repeated her exact words. Laura wrote them down. Then she quietly asked, Did Ethan ever tell you he was moving business records? No. Did he ever ask you to store boxes? Never. She nodded thoughtfully. The interview continued for another hour. Finally, Laura turned off the recorder. Mrs. Aldridge? Yes. I know this has been incredibly difficult. It has. I want you to understand something. I waited. Nothing you've shown us today suggests you knowingly participated in what happened. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost cried. So far the evidence supports exactly what you've told us. A mother who trusted her son. I lowered my eyes. I wish I'd asked more questions. Laura's voice softened. Most parents wouldn't have. Before we left, she handed me a business card. If Ethan contacts you about destroying records, she paused, or asks you to change your story, you want me to call. Immediately. Outside the building, Daniel and I stood quietly beside my car. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, he said, "Do you know what protected you today? The letters. Not just the letters. The timeline." I looked at him. "You never tried to rewrite history." He tapped the binder. "You dated everything. You kept everything. You documented everything. That matters." On the drive home, I realized he was right. Without intending to, I'd created a complete record of the truth. Every envelope had arrived on a specific day. Every conversation had happened in a specific order. Every promise Ethan had made could now be compared with what he had actually done. When I reached home, another envelope waited inside the mailbox. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Weeks earlier, opening another collection letter had filled me with dread. Now it felt different. Not because the contents hurt less, because I finally understood their value. Each envelope wasn't merely another demand for money. It was another piece of evidence, another date, another fact, another thread leading back to the same truth. I carried it inside without opening it. Instead, I placed it neatly on top of the binder. The stack had become too large for a single folder. It now filled an entire storage box. As I closed the lid, I suddenly realized something remarkable. The very letters Ethan had tried so desperately to keep away from me were becoming the strongest proof that I had never been part of his deception. Every attempt to hide the truth had preserved it instead. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not happiness, not relief, something quieter. Hope. Because the truth no longer depended on memories. It lived inside hundreds of dated documents. And documents, unlike frightened people, never forgot what happened. The call came 3 days after my meeting with Detective Laura Jenkins. I recognized Ethan's number immediately. For a long moment, I simply watched my phone vibrate across the kitchen table. The last time we'd spoken, he'd stood in my home with no explanation left to offer, only silence. I answered anyway. "Hello?" His voice sounded different, not defensive, not confident, just exhausted. "Mom?" "Yes. Can I come over?" I looked out the window toward the maple tree Richard had planted the year Ethan was born. "Are you coming to explain?" "I'm coming because I don't know what else to do." Those words told me more than anything he'd said in weeks. "You can come. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When he arrived, he wasn't carrying takeout. He wasn't carrying pastries or coffee. For the first time in years, he arrived empty-handed. His truck was gone. Instead, he drove an older sedan I didn't recognize. As soon as he stepped onto my porch, I noticed how much weight he had lost. His shoulders sagged beneath his jacket. His beard had grown in unevenly. His eyes looked older than 41. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in months. I opened the door. He didn't hug me. Neither of us knew whether we still could. We sat across from one another at my kitchen table. The same table where Richard had helped Ethan with homework. The same table where birthday cakes had been cut. The same table where I had confronted him only days before. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "They took the second truck yesterday." I looked at him quietly. "The bank?" He nodded. "I couldn't stop them." I waited. "The trailer goes next week." He laughed bitterly. "I used to think losing equipment would be the worst part. And now, it isn't." His voice cracked. "I've already lost everything that mattered." I folded my hands together. "What do you mean?" He stared at the wood grain in the table. "Vanessa moved into the guest room." My heart sank. "She says she doesn't know who I am anymore." He swallowed hard. "Lily barely talks to me." Tears gathered in his eyes. I don't blame them. For several moments, all I heard was the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Then he whispered, "I've been lying to everyone. Not just me. Everyone." "When did it start?" He closed his eyes. I honestly don't know. I remained silent. The first lie was small. He gave a tired smile. I missed one supplier payment. What happened? I told myself I'd pay it after the next project. He shook his head slowly. Then another bill came. And another. I borrowed money. His breathing became uneven. That solved the problem. For a while. Exactly. He looked at me. I thought success was just around the corner. So every loan felt temporary. Yes. I never planned to leave anyone unpaid. I believe that. He blinked in surprise. You do. I believe you didn't start with bad intentions. He lowered his head again. But intentions stopped mattering. He nodded. They did. I kept believing one more contract would fix everything. His voice grew quieter. When it didn't, I borrowed again. I thought about the spreadsheets Daniel had shown me, the timeline, the endless cycle of debt replacing debt. You convinced yourself tomorrow would solve yesterday. A tear rolled down his cheek. Yes. I really believed it. He wiped his face with both hands. I wasn't trying to become a criminal. I know. I was trying to become successful. The sentence broke my heart, because I believed him. Somewhere along the way, Ethan had stopped chasing success. He had begun chasing escape. Escape from creditors. Escape from embarrassment. Escape from admitting he'd failed. When did you realize you couldn't fix it? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he whispered, the day Lily asked why I never smiled anymore. I felt my throat tighten. How long ago was that? Almost a year. A year. For an entire year. My son had known he was losing. Yet every Sunday afternoon he still sat in my living room pretending everything was fine. Why didn't you tell me? He looked at me with eyes full of shame. Because you're my mother. I know. You believed in me. I did. I couldn't stand the thought of watching that belief disappear. It wouldn't have. He looked confused. I would have been disappointed. I nodded. I would have been frightened. Another nod. But I would have stood beside you. Fresh tears filled his eyes. I know that now. No. I spoke gently. I don't think you did. He leaned back in his chair. I kept thinking I could protect everyone. By lying. By buying time. The exact phrase Lily had overheard. I thought if I solved it before anyone found out, no one would get hurt, he nodded. Instead, I hurt everyone. His shoulders began shaking. For the first time since he was a little boy, I watched my son cry without trying to hide it. I ruined everything. I let him cry. Some pain cannot be interrupted. Eventually he looked up. I need to tell you something else. I waited. I've hired my own attorney. Good. I'm cooperating. With the investigation. Yes. He swallowed. I turned over every business record. I thought about the boxes Lily had mentioned. The ones in the garage. He nodded. Everything. No more hiding. No. He took a deep breath. I also signed papers removing your address from every active filing. Those words should have brought relief. Instead, they brought sadness. Because they had arrived years too late. You should have done that a long time ago. I know. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it. Not because he said the words, because he finally stopped making excuses. There was no talk about future contracts. No promises that everything would soon improve. No claims that people misunderstood him. Only responsibility. Real responsibility. After another long silence, he reached into his jacket pocket. He placed a small envelope on the table. What is this? My keys. I frowned. The warehouse. The storage unit. The office. He slid them toward me. I don't want to hide anything anymore. I stared at the key. Weeks earlier, I would have thought they represented control. Now they represented surrender. I don't need these. I need you to know I'm done lying. I pushed the keys back toward him. No. He looked surprised. You keep them. Why? Because they're yours. I held his gaze. The responsibility is yours too. He slowly nodded. I understand. As he stood to leave, he hesitated beside the front door. Mom, yes. Do you think you'll ever trust me again? The question lingered between us. I answered honestly. I don't know. He nodded. I deserve that. But, he looked back. I haven't stopped loving you. His face crumpled. I don't think I deserve that either. Love isn't earned by perfection. I felt tears in my own eyes. But trust, I paused, is rebuilt one truthful decision at a time. He nodded slowly. I'll spend the rest of my life trying. After he left, I stood alone in the doorway, watching him drive away in that old borrowed sedan. For the first time in months, he hadn't driven away carrying another collection letter. He hadn't asked about the mail. He hadn't asked me to wait a little longer. He had simply told the truth. It wasn't enough to erase the damage. It wasn't enough to undo years of deception. But it was something I hadn't seen in a very long time. It was the first honest step my son had taken toward coming home. The first envelope that arrived after Ethan's confession looked almost identical to the dozens that had come before it. Plain white, certified mail, a return address from another law office. For weeks I had dreaded hearing the mail slot open. Now I walked toward it without hesitation. Fear had changed into responsibility. I carried the envelope to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and opened it slowly. Inside was a formal notice, informing me that one of Ethan's creditors had acknowledged receiving documentation proving I was not an owner-guarantor or officer of his company. Future legal correspondence regarding that particular account would be directed exclusively to Ethan and his attorney. I read the letter twice. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first official document that separated my life from Ethan's business. I folded it carefully and placed it in a brand new folder. This one carried a different label, Resolved. For the first time in months, that folder contained more hope than fear. A few days later, Daniel Pierce called with another update. There's been progress. What kind? Ethan's attorney has negotiated with several creditors. Is it enough? It isn't a miracle. I appreciated his honesty. But it's a beginning. I explained that Ethan had voluntarily turned over financial records, cooperated with investigators, and agreed to liquidate business assets rather than continue operating under false expectations. That matters, Daniel said. To whom? To everyone. He paused before continuing. Judges notice honesty. So do creditors. And investigators. I thought about Ethan sitting across from me at my kitchen table, finally admitting that he had stopped trying to save his business long before he admitted it aloud. His confession hadn't erased the damage, but it had stopped creating new victims. That alone mattered. The following Saturday, Margaret Ellis convinced me to leave the house. You've spent weeks surrounded by paperwork. I know. You need sunshine. I suppose I do. We walked through Franklin Park Conservatory, one of my favorite places in Columbus. Autumn had painted the gardens in shades of deep red and gold. Children laughed near the fountains. Couples wandered quietly beneath the glass greenhouse. Life had continued while I buried myself beneath financial records. It felt almost strange to be among ordinary people again. Margaret smiled as we watched a little girl chase butterflies. You look lighter. I don't feel lighter, but different. I nodded slowly. I spent so much energy trying to understand how this happened. And now I think about what comes after. She squeezed my arm. That's healing. I hope so. That evening my phone buzzed. It was Vanessa. Hi, Constance. Hello. I wanted you to know. She hesitated. Ethan moved into the apartment above the old hardware store. He moved out. For now. I closed my eyes. I see. We agreed Lily needed stability. How is she? Better. Vanessa's voice softened. She misses her father. I'm sure she does. But she also needed the arguing to stop. I couldn't disagree. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa had been sleeping. Lily had lived in the middle of every whispered argument, every late-night phone call, every unopened bill. Children hear far more than adults realize. Before ending the call, Vanessa surprised me. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I do. She continued before I could interrupt. I should have told you the truth much sooner. We both wanted to believe him. Yes. I kept thinking love meant protecting him. So did I. There was a long silence. Finally, she whispered, I've learned that protecting someone from consequences isn't the same as loving them. After we hung up, I wrote her words in my notebook. They deserve to be remembered. 2 weeks later, I received another invitation from Detective Laura Jenkins. This meeting felt different from the first. Less like an investigation, more like a conclusion. Laura greeted me with the same calm smile. I have good news. I'm listening. Based on the evidence we've reviewed, we've formally documented that you were an uninvolved third party. A weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying finally lifted. So my name will not be included as a responsible party. I thanked her quietly. Then she added something unexpected. I'd like to tell you something off the record. I nodded. We investigate many financial fraud cases. She folded her hands. Very few people keep records the way you did. I smiled faintly. I was a librarian. She laughed. I suppose old habits never disappear. They don't. Her expression became thoughtful again. You didn't save yourself because you knew the law. No. You saved yourself because you respected the truth. Those words stayed with me all the way home. A week later, Ethan asked if he could meet me for coffee. Not at my house, not at his apartment. A small cafe halfway between us. When I arrived, he was already waiting. He looked healthier than he had a month earlier. Still tired, still thinner, but calmer. There were no expensive watches, no polished truck parked outside, no appearance to maintain. Only my son. I started working. I looked up. Doing what? For another contractor. I smiled. How does it feel? He gave a small laugh. Humbling, I imagine. I answer to someone else now. And it turns out I don't hate it. We both smiled. For the first time in many months, the conversation wasn't about debt, or lawyers, or collection letters. It was about ordinary life. Eventually, Ethan grew serious again. I sold the last of the company equipment. I nodded. I know. It hurt. I'm sure it did. But every sale paid another creditor. He looked directly at me. I should have done it a year ago. Probably. I was afraid people would think I failed. I reached across the table and gently touched his hand. Ethan. He looked up. Failure isn't what people remember. No. They remember what you do after failure. He sat quietly for several seconds. I'm trying. I can see that. When we finished our coffee, he hugged me. Not because everything had been repaired, because we had finally stopped pretending nothing was broken. As winter approached, I found myself opening the resolved folder more often than the old evidence boxes. One creditor after another updated its records. More letters stopped arriving. My mailbox slowly returned to carrying ordinary things again. Christmas cards, church newsletters, catalogs I never ordered. The sound of the mail slot no longer made my heart race. One snowy afternoon, Lily visited after school. She looked around my kitchen before smiling. There aren't any boxes anymore. No, just cookies. I laughed. I like this better. So do I. She hugged me tightly. I think Dad smiles more now. I looked out the window as snowflakes drifted across the yard. So do I. Sometimes healing doesn't begin when every problem disappears. Sometimes it begins the moment everyone finally stops hiding from the truth. And that was exactly where our family had finally arrived. Spring arrived quietly that year. After months of opening my front door to cold winds and certified letters, I found myself opening it to birdsong blooming dogwood trees and ordinary mail. Ordinary. I had never appreciated that word until my mailbox stopped delivering fear. Most mornings now contained grocery coupons, church newsletters, birthday cards from old friends, and the occasional gardening catalog. Nothing demanding payment, nothing threatening legal action, nothing reminding me of the life my son had nearly buried beneath years of borrowed promises. One Saturday morning, I stood on my front porch trimming the rose bushes Richard had planted decades earlier when I noticed Ethan's sedan pulling into my driveway. He wasn't early. He wasn't carrying documents. He wasn't asking about the mail. Instead, he climbed out holding a small toolbox. I thought I'd fix that loose porch railing. I smiled. You noticed. I noticed months ago. He looked embarrassed. I just never slowed down long enough to repair it. Well, I stepped aside. You've got time now. He laughed softly. I do. That simple conversation meant more to me than either of us admitted aloud. For years, every visit had revolved around his business. Phone calls, contracts, deliveries, deadlines. Now he spent nearly 2 hours replacing a few weathered boards and tightening loose bolts while we talked about completely ordinary things. The Cincinnati Reds, Margaret's vegetable garden, a new bakery that had opened downtown. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden, nothing dishonest. When he finally packed away his tools, he looked around the porch with quiet satisfaction. I forgot how good it feels to finish something. I looked at him. What do you mean? In business. He leaned against the railing. Nothing was ever finished. There was always another payment. Another phone call. Another emergency. He shook his head. I kept chasing the next problem. And now, I fixed a porch. He smiled. It feels better than closing half the contracts I used to celebrate. Those words stayed with me long after he drove away. Sometimes peace arrives disguised as ordinary work. A few weeks later, Ethan invited me to lunch. Not at an expensive steakhouse. Not at one of the fashionable restaurants he used to choose whenever he wanted to convince everyone business was booming. Instead, he suggested a small family diner outside Columbus. The waitress knew him by name. Good to see you again, Ethan, he smiled. Good to be back. After she walked away, I looked at him curiously. You've been here before. I eat here every Friday. Alone. Sometimes. Sometimes with the crew. Crew. The contractor I work for. I smiled. So you're part of a team again. He nodded. I didn't realize how lonely I'd become trying to be the boss. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. I thought success meant nobody telling me what to do. And now, I've learned there's nothing wrong with answering to someone honest. I watched him carefully. The confidence I saw now felt completely different from the confidence he'd carried during the years of endless borrowing. Back then, his confidence had been loud, expensive, performative. Now it was quiet, steady, earned. After lunch, he reached into his wallet and pulled out an old photograph. It showed him standing beside Richard at 16 years old. Both of them were building a wooden picnic table in our backyard. Dad used to say something. I recognized the photograph immediately. He said a lot of things. Ethan smiled sadly. He always said, he paused before quoting his father, if you build something crooked, don't hide it with paint. Tear it apart and build it straight. I laughed softly through unexpected tears. I remember. I spent years painting over crooked boards. He looked down at the photograph. I should have started over much sooner. That afternoon, I visited Margaret. She poured iced tea while we sat beneath the maple tree in her backyard. So, she asked with a knowing smile, how's your boy? I thought carefully before answering. He's changing. Really changing. I think so. Margaret nodded. There's a difference. There is. The first kind of change happens because people get caught. And the second, because they finally understand. I looked toward the garden where tulips had begun blooming. I think he's finally understanding. A few days later, Lily invited me to her middle school spring concert. When I arrived, Ethan and Vanessa were already there. They sat several seats apart, still separated, still healing. But when Lily walked onto the stage, both parents stood together to applaud. Neither seemed interested in pretending everything had returned to normal. Instead, they focused entirely on their daughter. That alone felt like progress. After the concert, Lily ran toward me. Grandma. She hugged me tightly. Did you hear my solo? You were wonderful. She beamed. Then she looked at both of her parents. They both came. I noticed. I'm glad. So am I. Children rarely ask for perfection. They simply want honesty. That evening, Ethan called. I've been thinking. Dangerous habit. He laughed. I know. Then his voice became serious. I'd like to start another business someday. I remained quiet. But not now. What changed? I don't need to prove anything anymore. I smiled. If that day comes, it'll be different. How? I'll build it slowly. No borrowed appearances. No pretending. No hiding. He paused. And my mailing address will be my own. I laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. That's a very good place to start. Summer arrived before I realized how much time had passed. One evening, Ethan and Lily helped me clean the garage. While sorting old boxes, Lily discovered one labeled Dad's Projects. Inside were handmade birdhouses Ethan had built as a child. One had a crooked roof, another leaned slightly to one side. Lily picked up the worst-looking one. Dad, she laughed. This one's awful. Ethan grinned. I know. Why didn't Grandpa throw it away? He looked at the faded handwriting on the bottom. Richard had written only 6 words. Built honestly. Keep improving. Love, Dad. Ethan sat quietly for a long moment. Then he closed the box gently. I spent years trying to look successful. He looked at Lily. But Grandpa was proud of me before I built anything perfect. I watched father and daughter standing together inside that dusty garage. For years, Ethan had believed success would earn love. Now he was finally learning something his father had tried to teach him decades earlier. Love comes first. Integrity keeps it. As the sun began setting beyond the open garage door, Ethan carried the old birdhouse outside. Instead of hiding its crooked roof, he hung it from the maple tree beside my porch. It's not perfect, Lily said. No, he smiled. But it's honest. And somehow, that little crooked birdhouse became the most beautiful thing hanging in my yard. Because unlike everything Ethan had built during those lost years, it no longer pretended to be something it wasn't. Almost a year after the first collection letter changed my life. I walked to my mailbox on a bright September morning without thinking twice about it. The maple tree in my front yard had already begun turning shades of gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across the neighborhood. Children waited for the school bus at the corner. Margaret Ellis waved from across the street while watering her flowers. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary. I opened the mailbox. Inside were 3 envelopes, a church bulletin, a gardening catalog, 1 certified letter. For just a fraction of a second, my heart tightened. Old habits die slowly. I carried the envelopes inside, set the kettle on the stove, and sat down at the same kitchen table where so much of my life had changed. The certified envelope came from the Ohio Secretary of State's Business Services Division. I opened it carefully. Inside was a simple confirmation notice. It stated that all active business registrations previously associated with my address had been officially amended. My residence was no longer listed as the mailing address, registered office, or correspondence location for any company connected to Ethan Aldridge. I read the letter once, then again. Then I quietly folded it. No dramatic courtroom victory, no applause, no celebration. Just one ordinary piece of paper quietly telling me that my home finally belonged only to me again. I walked to the hallway closet where several storage boxes had sat untouched for months. One by one, I carried them into the living room. Each box held the collection letters that had once terrified me. 17 from collection agencies, 9 from banks, 5 legal notices, insurance warnings, supplier invoices, tax correspondence. Every envelope had once felt like another weight pressing down on my shoulders. Now they felt different. I wasn't looking at debt anymore. I was looking at a timeline, a record of mistakes, a record of truth, a record of survival. I carefully placed the newest confirmation letter on top of the stack. Then I closed the lid. Not because I wanted to forget, because I no longer needed those papers to protect me. Their work was finished. A knock at the front door interrupted my thoughts. When I opened it, Ethan stood there holding a small cardboard box. I hope I'm not interrupting. You never interrupt. He smiled. There was something peaceful about him now. His face still carried the lines carved there by difficult years, but the constant tension had disappeared. He looked like himself again. Or perhaps, like the person he'd always been before fear took over. I brought something. He handed me the box. Inside rested an old brass mailbox flag. I recognized it immediately. My old mailbox, he nodded. I found it while cleaning the warehouse after the lease officially ended. I turned it over in my hands. Years ago, Richard had replaced it after winter storms damaged the original. I hadn't seen it in decades. I thought you might want it. I do. He looked around the house. It feels different here. It does. No stacks of papers. No investigation binders. No corkboard. I smiled. Just family pictures. He looked toward the living room wall. Several framed photographs had replaced the giant evidence board months earlier. One showed Lily at her spring concert. Another captured Margaret and me laughing during the neighborhood picnic. One photograph showed Ethan repairing my porch railing. None of them pretended life had always been perfect. They simply reflected where we were now. I started something. He broke the silence. What? A savings account. I smiled. That's good. I put $20 into it every week. Planning another business. He laughed. No. I promised myself something. What? I won't own another company until I can build one without borrowing money I can't repay. I looked at him with quiet pride. That's a wise promise. I learned it the hard way. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket. I almost forgot. He handed me a single key. What's this? The last mailbox key. I frowned. I don't understand. The old post office box I rented for business. You closed it. Yesterday. He smiled. The postal clerk asked if I wanted to keep the key. And I told her it had done enough hiding. I closed my fingers around the tiny brass key. Somehow it felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its weight, because of everything it represented. A few weeks later, our family gathered for Sunday dinner at my house. It was the first time in nearly 2 years that everyone seemed genuinely relaxed. Vanessa and Ethan were still living separately while rebuilding their marriage through counseling, but they laughed together naturally. Lily talked excitedly about high school applications. Margaret joined us as she often did. At one point, Lily looked around the table. Can I ask everyone something? We all nodded. She smiled. Can we promise never to keep secrets like that again? Silence settled across the room. Then Ethan answered first. I promise. Vanessa nodded. I promise. I looked at my granddaughter. So do I. She smiled. Good. Then she returned to eating mashed potatoes as though she had just solved the simplest problem in the world. Perhaps children understand truth better than adults. On the evening of my 68th birthday, I sat alone on my porch watching the sunset. The repaired railing Ethan had built the previous spring still felt sturdy beneath my hand. Above me, the little crooked birdhouse he and Richard had made years ago still hung from the maple tree. A pair of bluebirds had built a nest inside. I smiled. Richard used to say that birds never cared whether a house was perfect, only whether it was safe. Maybe families weren't so different. None of us are perfect. All of us make mistakes. Some mistakes are small. Some nearly destroy everything. But honesty gives broken things a chance to become safe again. As darkness settled across the neighborhood, I walked one last time to my mailbox. It stood exactly where it always had. Same street, same house, same address. The difference wasn't the mailbox. The difference was me. A year earlier, every envelope had filled me with fear because I believed they carried only bad news. Now I understood something much deeper. Those collection letters had never been my enemies. Each one had uncovered another lie. Each one had pushed me one step closer to the truth. Each one had forced my son to face a life he could no longer hide from. In the end, the greatest debt Ethan owed was never measured in dollars. It was measured in trust, And trust, unlike money, can never be repaid with a single check. It is rebuilt slowly, conversation by conversation, choice by choice, truth by truth. As I closed my mailbox that evening, I realized it had become more than a place where letters arrived. It had become a reminder that the truth always finds its address eventually. And when it finally does, opening the envelope is the first step toward freedom.